All right, welcome to another deep dive. We get a lot of requests, and today's is pretty interesting. It's about Lua, and honestly, I've been meaning to learn more about this
Oh,
myself.
yeah, Lua, it's super cool.
Yeah, it pops up in game development all the time, so I'm really excited to get into it. For this deep dive, you sent us two guides, one for beginners and one that's super in depth. So,
Yeah, we're going to be bridging the gap between the comprehensive Lua programming guide that's going to give us our foundation, and then the advanced Lua programming guide, which is going to get into the nitty-gritty.
okay, awesome. So, before we get too far, for someone who maybe has never even heard of Lua, what is it? Why should they care?
Well, Lua is really cool because it's super versatile. You can use it for a whole bunch of stuff. It's lightweight, so it's really efficient and doesn't take up a lot of resources, which makes it really good for embedding into other applications like games.
Oh yeah, games.
Yeah.
I always hear about Lua being used in games.
Yeah, it's huge in games. Like Roblox, a big chunk of that is actually powered by Lua.
Wow. That's crazy. I had no idea it was that prevalent.
Yeah, it's everywhere. But it's not just limited to games. It's also used in web development, for scripting, and you can even use it for scientific computing.
Wow, that's super interesting. Our sources mention it's relatively easy to learn as well.
Yeah, getting started with Lua is super straightforward. No matter what operating system you're on, you can install it. And the syntax, the way you write the code, is actually designed to be pretty intuitive, even if you've never coded before.
Okay, that's really good for anyone who's a little intimidated by coding.
Absolutely.
Now, both the beginner and advanced guides talk about these core concepts like data types, variables, and control structures. Can you just give us a quick rundown of what those are and why they're important in Lua?
Sure. So you can think of those as the fundamental building blocks of any Lua program. Data types are like the ingredients. You've got numbers, you've got strings of text, booleans, which are true or false values, and then you've got something called nil, which basically means nothing.
Nil. Okay.
Yeah, and then you've got variables, and those are like containers for those values.
So number goes in variable, string goes in variable, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And then you've got control structures, which let you control the flow of the program. If this happens, then do that, or repeat this until something happens.
So the logic, the
Yeah,
steps.
exactly. The logic, the steps.
Yeah.
So without those building blocks, you really can't build anything meaningful in Lua.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
I like that analogy. Like building a house, you got to have the right materials in the plan.
exactly.
All right, so we've got the foundation. Now let's move on to something that both guides seem to emphasize in tables.
Yeah.
What's the big deal with tables in Lua?
Tables are really cool. They're like the heart of Lua. They're incredibly flexible. You can use them as lists, like an ordered list, like a shopping list.
Right.
Or you can use them as dictionaries, which is where you associate keys with values like an actual dictionary where you have the word and the definition.
Yeah.
So you can do both of those with tables, which is what makes them so powerful.
So they're kind of multi-purpose tools, and they can be both at the same time.
Yeah, they can.
Wow, that's really cool. And the advanced guide mentions something called metables. I'm not even going to pretend like I know what that is, but it sounds like it takes the flexibility to a whole new level.
Yeah, metables are where it gets really interesting. But before we get into that, have you ever heard of object-oriented programming?
Oh yeah, OOP.
Yeah, it's a really popular way to structure code where you create kind of like blueprints for objects that can interact with each other. Now, Lua is not strictly an object-oriented language, but it can simulate those principles using, you guessed it, tables.
Ah, so tables are the key here.
And those metables we mentioned earlier, they play a key role in this.
Okay, so Lua lets you kind of mimic object-oriented programming, even though it's not specifically built for it.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. All right, let's break down these metables then. Our advanced guide gives this example about custom addition using metables. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so with metables, you can basically change how tables behave by default. They contain these special functions called meta methods. And for instance, there's this meta method called add. And with that, you can redefine what happens when you try to add two tables together.
Yeah.
So instead of just combining the contents, you can make it do a specific calculation. You can manipulate data, or you can even trigger a chain reaction.
So it's like having a secret control panel for your tables.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a secret control panel where you can tweak how they behave in different situations.
Okay. That is really interesting. I'm starting to see why Lua is considered so powerful. Now, there's this other thing that comes up in both guides' coroutines. These sound fascinating.
Yeah, coroutines are one of Lua's superpowers.
Superpower, okay.
They allow you to write functions that can actually pause their execution, yield control back to the main program, and then pick up right where they left off.
Wait, functions can pause?
Yes, it's like putting someone on hold and then picking up right where you left off.
Well, that's a good analogy.
Yeah. So coroutines enable you to do multitasking within a single Lua thread. So, imagine you're developing a game and you want to download some assets in the background without freezing up the whole game.
Okay.
Coroutines can handle that really well.
So you don't have to have one long process. You can kind of have these things running at the same time.
Exactly.
That's incredibly powerful. But all this multitasking with complex code makes me think, how does Lua handle all the memory management? Doesn't that get messy?
Well, Lua has a system called garbage collection. You can think of it as an automatic cleanup crew that basically just goes around and frees up memory that's no longer being used. So it keeps things nice and tidy.
Oh, okay. So it's like a self-cleaning oven for your code.
Yeah, exactly.
Phew, that's a relief. But I'm guessing there are times when you do have to worry about performance, especially in game development.
Yeah, absolutely. So, while Lua is generally very efficient, you can optimize your code even further. And the advanced guide goes into some tips for that.
Okay, we'll have to get to that. Before we do that, though, I'm really curious about something the advanced guide mentions. It's called the Foreign Function Interface, or FFI.
Oh, the FFI.
What in the world is that?
It's basically a bridge between Lua and C.
C, that lower level language. Why would we want to mix those two?
Well, for some tasks that need just raw power, like complex calculations or graphics, C is significantly faster than Lua. So the FFI lets Lua directly call functions and access data structures that are written in C.
So it's like a way to give Lua a turbo boost.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, imagine you're making a game and you need to render some really complex graphics. You can use the FFI to access a C library that's specifically designed for that.
Oh, wow. So you can kind of get the best of both worlds.
Exactly. You get the ease of use of Lua with the power of C.
That is really, really cool. Okay, so we've talked about the FFI, garbage collection, core routines, metables, and all those core building blocks like variables and data types. What else do we need to know about Lua?
Well, there's one more thing about how Lua works that we need to touch on, and that's that Lua is single-threaded.
Wait, single-threaded, but we were just talking about how it can do all this multitasking.
Right, and that might seem like a contradiction, but Lua being single-threaded is actually part of what makes it so fast and simple for a lot of things. But when you do need that extra power of multiple threads, Lua has a really clever solution: external libraries.
So, like add-ons.
Exactly. Libraries like Lua Lanes and Lua Threads can actually provide that threading support, allowing you to run multiple Lua states at the same time.
Wow, so even though Lua is single-threaded at its core, it's not limited to doing just one thing at a time.
Exactly.
That's amazing. Okay, one more thing before we move on. I know some programming languages have this thing called data typing, where you have to tell the computer exactly what kind of data you're working with. Does Lua have anything like that?
It does, but Lua's approach is a little different. Unlike those languages that have strict data typing, Lua uses what's called dynamic typing.
Dynamic typing, what does that mean?
It means you don't have to tell Lua beforehand what type of data a variable will hold.
Yeah.
Lua figures it out as you go along based on the value you assign.
So if I put the number 10 into a variable, Lua knows it's a number. But if I then put the word hello into that same variable, Lua just rolls with it and knows it's now a string.
That's right. It makes Lua code really concise and easy to write because you don't have to worry about all those declarations. But you do need to be aware of how you're using those variables because you might get some surprises if you're not careful.
Okay, so it's like a trade-off. More flexibility, but you have to be a bit more careful about how you use your variables.
Exactly. And it's one of the things that makes Lua really unique.
Well, this has been super helpful already. We've gone from the basics to some pretty advanced stuff. I'm really starting to see how it all fits together.
Yeah.
But now that our listener has all this knowledge, what can they actually do with it?
That's the fun part. There are so many possibilities with Lua. It's time to unleash the power. So, now that you've got the basics of Lua down, you can actually start creating some pretty amazing things. Like you can write scripts to automate tasks, build games, even develop web applications. You can explore embedded systems. The possibilities are really endless. But before you get too far into that, there's one more concept that's really important, and that's Lua's global environment.
Global environment. What's that?
Well, think of it as like a shared space where all your Lua variables live by default.
Oh,
It's convenient at first, but as your programs get bigger, it can get kind of messy, like a room where everything's just piled up in one spot.
oh, I know that feeling all too well. My desk is, yeah, pretty cluttered.
Right. So Lua has a way to deal with that, and that's by encouraging you to use local variables.
Local variables.
Yeah, those are variables that only exist within a specific part of your code, like inside a function.
Oh, okay. So instead of having one giant bin for everything, you're creating these smaller containers to keep things organized.
Exactly. And using local variables not only makes your code tidier, but it also helps with performance.
Really? How so?
Well, accessing local variables is actually faster than accessing global ones.
Oh, that makes sense. So local variables, good for organization and for speed.
Exactly. Now, another good habit to get into is being mindful of how you use global functions.
Global functions, those are the ones you can use anywhere in your code, right?
Right. And while they can be necessary sometimes, if you have too many of them, it can clutter up your code and make it harder to understand. It's like having tools scattered all over your workshop instead of organized in a toolbox.
Yeah, I can see how that would get confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So should we try to avoid using global functions as much as possible?
Not necessarily avoid them, but use them strategically. When you can, group related functions together in modules, or even use local functions to keep things neat and tidy. Remember, a well organized code base is a joy to work with.
Okay, great advice. So we've covered so much ground. We've
Mm.
talked about the core building blocks, those tables and metables, which still sound a little mysterious to me, but we're getting there.
You're doing great.
Thanks. And then we got into those advanced techniques like coroutines and even learned how to tap into the power of C with that FFI thing.
And we even talked about good coding practices like using local variables and keeping our global namespace organized.
Right. That's super important. But now I'm wondering about actually writing Lua code. Is it a really strict language, or does it give you some flexibility in how you express your ideas?
Well, that brings us back to that dynamic typing thing we talked about earlier.
Oh, right, where Lua figures out what kind of data you're using as you go along.
Exactly. You don't have to declare everything up front. It makes the code really concise and easy to write.
But we also talked about how that means you got to be careful with your variables.
Right. It's all about balance. The flexibility is great, but you do have to be mindful.
Okay, makes sense. So now that we've got all this Lua knowledge under our belts, where do we go from here? How can we actually put these skills to use?
Well, that's where the fun begins. Now you have the foundation to actually build something.
Okay, let's talk about some of the ways we can put Lua to work.
First up, game development. I know we've mentioned it a bunch, but Lua is just perfect for game scripting.
Why is that?
It's lightweight, it's easy to integrate, and platforms like Roblox and Corona SDK use it extensively. Even big game engines like Unreal Engine and Godot have Lua embedded in them.
So if you've ever thought about making a game, Lua could be your ticket.
Absolutely. There are tons of resources out there to help you get started.
That's awesome. What about other applications? Is Lua only good for games?
Oh no, not at all. Lua is also great for scripting and automating tasks. Like if you're a system administrator, you could use Lua to streamline processes. Or if you're just tired of doing repetitive things on your computer, Lua can help you automate that.
So like if I wanted to, I don't know, resize a bunch of images or rename a bunch of files automatically, I could use Lua for that.
Exactly. It's perfect for that kind of thing.
That's awesome. So we got games, we've got automation. What else?
Web development.
Wait, really? I thought Lua was more of a game thing.
It is popular for games, but it can also be used on the server side to build dynamic websites and web applications.
Interesting.
Frameworks like OpenResty and Lapis actually use Lua for that. They leverage its speed and flexibility.
So Lua is really multi-talented. It can do it all.
It really can. And for those who really want to get into cutting-edge tech, there's also embedded systems.
Embedded systems, what are those?
Think about devices like smart home appliances, wearables, even cars. They all have embedded systems that control how they work.
Oh, wow.
And Lua is perfect for programming those devices because it's so small and efficient.
So Lua is powering all this technology that's all around us.
It really is. And the best part is the Lua community is amazing. There are so many resources, tutorials, open source projects, and everyone is super helpful and welcoming.
That's great to hear.
Y-
So learning Lua isn't just about the language itself. It's about joining this whole community of people who are passionate about it.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe someday you'll be sharing your Lua knowledge with the world, making awesome games, building incredible web applications, or even pushing the boundaries of embedded systems.
That's a great thought. Well, we've given our listeners a lot to think about already, but before we wrap things up, I want to leave them with one final question to ponder.
Hmm.
Earlier, we were talking about those Lua coroutines and how they can do multitasking within a single thread. I'm curious, now that we've gone through a bunch of other stuff, can you give us like a real-world example of how you might use those coroutines to make a game, more responsive, more engaging for the player?
Yeah, definitely. So let's imagine you're making a boss battle for your game.
Okay, boss battle classic.
Right. And you want this boss to have, different attack phases. Each one has its own animations, its own timing, all that. Now, you could try and cram all of that logic into one big function, but that could actually make the game feel kind of slow and clunky.
Yeah, yeah. You don't
Yeah.
want that.
So instead, you can use coroutines to break down those attack phases into smaller chunks of code.
So it's like instead of having one massive dance routine, you break it down into individual moves, each with its own pauses and timings.
That's a really good way to put it. Each coroutine could handle one specific part of the boss's behavior. Like, it does its thing, then it yields control back to the main game loop, waits for a bit, maybe for an animation to finish, and then it picks up where it left off.
So the game doesn't get bogged down waiting for one long process to finish.
Exactly. It stays nice and responsive to the player, even while all this complex stuff is happening in the background.
That's really smart. And I bet you could use that same idea for other things besides just boss battles, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like, think about NPCs, those non-player characters. You could use coroutines to give them their own schedules. Like waking up, going to work, all that. It makes the world feel so much more alive.
So coroutines can make a game world feel more believable, more immersive.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing what you can do with this concept of just pausing and resuming functions.
I know. Okay, one more question that's been on my mind. We talked about how Lua can talk to C code using that FFI, which is super cool for performance and all that. But when would a developer actually choose one approach over the other? Like when would they go with pure Lua versus bringing in C?
That's a really good question. And it often comes down to finding that sweet spot between how fast you can develop the game and how well it performs. So pure Lua code is usually quicker to write, and it's easier to maintain, to keep it organized and make changes later on. So if performance isn't a huge concern, that's often the way to go.
So like if you're building a game's user interface or some simple game logic, Lua on its own is probably enough.
Exactly. But, when you need to do some serious number crunching, like really complex physics simulations, or if you need to get down to the hardware level, that's when bringing in C code through the FFI can make a huge difference.
So it's about picking the right tool for the job.
Precisely. Sometimes you just need a hammer, and sometimes you need I don't know, a high-powered laser drill.
Right. And Lua lets you do both.
Exactly. It gives you that flexibility, which is one of the things that makes it so great.
Well, I think it's safe to say that our listeners are now armed with a pretty solid understanding of Lua.
Hmm.
We've gone from the basics all the way to some super advanced stuff.
They're ready to go out there and build amazing things.
Exactly. And they've also got a good sense of how Lua is actually used in the real world.
Yeah.
From games to web development, scripting, even those embedded systems we talked about. It's incredible how versatile this language is.
It really is. And with all the resources out there and the Lua community being so welcoming, anyone can dive in and start creating.
So to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep exploring, keep experimenting, and maybe someday you'll be the ones pushing the boundaries of Lua.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are so many possibilities just waiting to be discovered.
And on that note, this has been our deep dive into the amazing world of Lua programming. We'll catch you next time. Keep those questions coming and keep diving deep.